Welcome to the A to Z of the Sega Saturn, a video and series where I go through the alphabet and pick one essential title from a console's library to add to your collection. As I said in my Dreamcast video, it's entirely possible that I may make multiple videos for one console depending on the depth of the library, but for now, here is the first edition of the Sega Saturn. Starting with numbers, I'm starting with 3D Lemmings. Lemmings was one of those legendary games for me growing up. I never owned it on any system, but it seemed like every friend or cousin I had, they had it on a different variety of consoles. I didn't know for sure it was on the Saturn, but I almost didn't need to check. Of course Lemmings was on the Saturn. Now in 3D. As the name implies, there is a whole new dimension added to the gameplay, which means oh god, the controls are impossible. What's going on? I don't know how to do anything, but I am sure it's okay once you've gotten used to it. As an essential title, I don't think it is, but for numbers, there are not many options on the Sega Saturn. I mean, did you really want me to pick 6-inch, my darling? I would rather not use my usual pickup line on this show. Astal. This was a tough choice where I didn't let my RPG bias get the better of me. Astal, also, while not the best playing game of its genre, even on the system, it is a magical and beautiful game that everyone should have in their collection. And anytime I say that, I'm pretending as though money is not an issue, and somehow we live in a magical world where they're all like $10 and readily available. I'm not cross-checking current prices for these Sega Saturn games. Aren't they all like $1,000? But yeah, just keep that in mind. Astal is a real showpiece for the system's wonderful 2D capabilities, something which Sega very much didn't want to show in 1995 because that was all about the polygons. It was just the era, and so many didn't see the woods from the trees to realize what a magical visual roller coaster Astal is. The gameplay is simple for sure, but nowadays with overcomplicated games, it is a nice change of pace. Burning Rangers is a game that was killed by Sega themselves. Sega had already thrown in the towel for the Saturn by the time Burning Rangers released, and there was no market to sell it to. Which is a shame because it's one of the most exciting and interesting releases on the system, and one that I'm surprised Sega hasn't tried to bring back in some capacity. Is it the best firefighting game ever made? Probably. The controls take a little bit of getting used to as you move the camera around with the shoulder buttons, you put out fires, get energy crystals, and use those crystals to teleport survivors outside of the burning facility. You need quick reactions, a penchant for dodgy camera angles, and suspect hit detection, but it is a fun time. And if you don't want a game that's 30 hours too long, this is a fun, short burst piece of action.
Machine has been destroyed. I've secured this area. Rangers, use extreme caution.
Go around to the other side of the plant site.
Cotton 2. Owning a Saturn myself, I have very much come to truly appreciate how fantastic Cotton 2 is. Strange considering I was a bit apathetical towards it when I reviewed this game on the Nintendo Switch, but somehow it just works magically with a Saturn controller and on a CRT TV. This is a really good horizontal shooter that has so many fun systems, especially grabbing the enemy and lobbing them, and hopefully causing combos. It's beautiful, it sounds great, it's one of my favorite shooters ever. Of course, it only released in Japan, but there is an English translation patch. Not that it's necessary, even though the Cotton series often have cute and funny stories. Wow, this is painful, so many options, but I've got to go with Dragon Force. I think there is something about Dragon Force that is very Sega Saturn. It's where Sega were with RPGs in this era, and it's so unique from what Sony were offering at the same time. It's a complicated looking game, and I found it very overwhelming and scary at first, but soon you get used to it, and you can witness the epic battles with so many glorious sprites. Be prepared to spend a bit of time with this one, but it's definitely worth it in the end. It's one of the best looking games of the era in terms of 2D sprites. It may not have the mind-blowing 3D gamers and critics were looking for at this time, but it's held up exponentially well. E. Elevator action returns. Is a great evolution of the original arcade game, saying that this of course is an arcade game in and of itself. It's far more cool and stylish with some awesome visuals. It even includes the original game as a nice bonus, so you get best of both worlds. I hate to compare it to something like Mario Hotel, but it kind of is. You're entering all the necessary doors before getting to the exit. However, this is badass because you're like a super spy with a gun, not a fat Italian plumber. You shoot bad guys and dogs, and it's really tense and epic, maybe a bit slow paced if you try to take it as your usual run and gun. It will be stiff in comparison to those, but give it time, get used to it, and you will have an awesome time. This was only released in Japan. F. Fighters Megamix is another game I can say is so typical of the Sega Saturn vibe. It's a fighting game from Sega AM2 that mashes a couple of Sega series together to create a surprisingly fun and playable fighter. Virtua Fighter and Fighting Vipers come together, and even though I'm not a fan of fighting games, this is a lot of fun. It mixes the IPs well and is not overly gimmicky. It's just a fun fighter with lots of unlockable characters, including some you wouldn't expect. It's not only Virtua Fighter and Fighting Vipers. G. Guardian Heroes. There are a lot of options for G, but this one will be the clear winner. One of Treasure's best games ever, and an absolutely delightful Saturn exclusive beat 'em up that was originally looked down upon due to its beautiful 2D sprite work instead of going for rough, unsanded balls 3D. Well, 30 years later, Treasure are still laughing at how gangster they were for literally telling people they were awesome at 2D, so why risk doing 3D when it looks like shite? Okay, maybe they didn't say that last bit, but they were thinking it. This has incredible action with multiple characters, a surprising amount of story, multiple paths, and if you got friends, it's one of the most fun co-op games on the system. H. Herc's Adventure is a top-down action game filled with Greek mythology of sorts. Rather than something like a Zelda game, it's definitely more arcadey thanks to its multiple characters and potential co-op play. It's action-orientated with endless enemies coming at you, it's animated extremely well, and is a surprisingly comical game as you fight off skeletons and all manner of enemies. The gameplay can get a little repetitive, but if you're playing with a friend, you can have a good time. I. In the Hunt is another shooter from before the Saturn existed. It's from 1993, but that doesn't take away from an interesting and unique shmup that will look fantastic in your Sega Saturn library. It's a game from IREM, known for producing some great games in the genre, and this is one of my favorites. It was an earlier game from the same people who made one of the best arcade games of all time, Gun Force 2, and then later went on to form Nazca Corporation, who would make Metal Slug, and you can see that in the visual style. It's artistically one of the best shmups on the market. Okay, it does suffer from horrendous slowdown, but that's nothing new for these developers. It's tough, but fun, looks and feels good. J. JB Harold Blue Chicago Blues is a Japanese exclusive detective adventure game. I think if you've ever glanced over the Japanese market, you may have clocked the JB Harold series. Well, you can now get a patch for the Sega Saturn release to make it in English. Sadly, I'm having a bit of trouble getting that to work, but I'm assured it does work for those who aren't cursed with technical issues, such as myself. It's mostly FMV based, with choices to make after each one plays out. Cheesy, but pretty stylish, and it's something I could get into if it damn worked for me. K. Keio Flying Squadron 2 is one of those sequels that takes you by surprise. The original Sega CD game was a pure vertical shooter, but when the sequel arrived on the Sega Saturn, oh look, now it's mostly a side-scrolling platformer. What? How did that happen? It still has some shooter sections, but this is an honest-to-God 2D platformer. And it's not amazing, but it's still pretty good. It's tough as well. I found getting past the first level for a bit of footage quite an embarrassment of my skills. It's not instantly pick up and playable. You have to get used to its quirks and learn some of the trial and error things going on. But take your time and this cutesy game will charm you. The game did not get a release in North America sadly. Europe did get it though. Last Bronx was a late Saturn release, another arcade 3D fighter developed by AM3 on the Model 2. So perhaps there could have been a bit of friendly rivalry within Sega departments. I'm sure AM3 would have loved to have given AM2 a run for their money. And they did a commendable job here. It's probably not technically better than other Sega polygonal fighters, but it might be one of the most fun to pick up and play. It's also a bit darker than the cleaner games you may be used to. It looks great too. It's one of the best looking games on the system. If you change the name to Streets of Rage Fighter, it would not have looked out of place. It has the same kind of attitude, and this was my first time playing it for this video, and I was having a really fun time. Even just to capture a bit of footage, I could not put it down. Magic Knight Rayearth was the last released Sega Saturn game in North America. It took years from its 1995 Japanese release to get localized in 1998, well after everyone had forgotten about the Sega Saturn. But boy, was it a charming game to go out to. Based on an anime, this is a Bishoujo action RPG that's full of charm. It was done by Working Designs in the West, which I know some people absolutely detest, but for me, this is really well done. And if it wasn't for them, this wouldn't have been in anyone's Western Saturn collection. You gotta give credit where it's due. It's got loads of animated cutscenes, good voice acting, and an interesting story. The gameplay is simple. It's more like a Secret of Mana type gameplay where you can flick between 3 magical girls. It's very story heavy though, and despite the Working Design criticisms, I was charmed by it, even by the voice acting, which isn't of professional quality like it would be if it was made today. It kind of feels like they just found people off the street, but they tried their best, and I really like it.
Wait a minute. I wonder if this could be the Forest of Silence. Well, there's only one way to find out. Let's get moving.
Nights into Dreams. What even is this game? I've never been able to get my tongue around it. You can describe what one does, but how to pigeonhole it? It's one of the weirdest yet enchanting games ever made, as you fly through hoops, do laps, and often hope for the best that you trigger something else. Your first playthrough will be a mess and confusing, but once you get the knack of it, replays will be smooth and you'll be going for those high-ranking grades. It was a magical game that was a tentpole in the Sega Saturn's library. Off-World Interceptor Extreme. This was not an easy choice since the pool of games is small and most of them are Japanese exclusives without much desire for us Westerners to import, so almost by default, O has to go to this game. It's not a bad game. After playing it for this video, it's actually alright. It's a sci-fi vehicular combat game that looks like it was made in the same vein as those weird Crystal Dynamics 3DO games. Oh wait, that is exactly what this is. A Crystal Dynamics game that was originally made for the 3DO. It reminds me of Spy Hunter a little bit, survive to the end of the level, pick up weapons, and money to upgrade. It's simple, but alright, and has some bizarre Mystery Science Theater 3000 cutscenes. Why? I don't know. Come on.
Does he think he's the Crow? I wish he was the Crow, then he'd be dead already.
P. Panzer Dragoon Zwei. This could have easily gone to the first game, and I did initially pick the first since it's the one I'm the most familiar with. The sequel, not so much, but I am told it is the better of the two. Both are great though, rail shooters that have incredible world building, art design, and fun gameplay to go along with it. It's like an evolution of classic arcade games as you pilot a dragon, locking onto enemies and firing away. There is a third game in the series that many may say is even better, and I'm sure it is, but Panzer Dragoon Saga is not as iconic as the original style games. I'm sorry JRPG fans, but I gotta give it to the rail shooter. Q. Quake. There aren't that many first-person shooters on the system, and those that are can range from decent to poor. Quake is one of those that is decent. It's not a perfect, ideal rendition of id's classic shooter, but it provides a decent enough port that makes it still fun to play on your 32-bit Sega Saturn. It functions and provides good level design and hectic gunplay, although shooting tiny pixelated targets from miles away, of whom can seemingly see you perfectly while you're squinting at them, it's a good solid time though. I was having fun playing it for this video. R. Radiant Silvergun. This is a classic shooter. Some will say it's the greatest of all time, or at least of the 32-bit era. It's a kind of shmup that you can pick up and play for the first time, and in 5 minutes declare it a masterpiece. It's a masterpiece, yeah, a masterpiece. Even if you have no idea how to play it properly, as you can see from my gameplay. This was my first time playing it and being completely clueless, but afterwards, after I stopped recording, I immediately went online and typed in how to play Radiant Silvergun properly because boy I was in. Comboing colors, it's a very complicated game if you want it to be, and it's probably not worth the hundreds of dollars for a Saturn copy. Maybe pick up the Nintendo Switch version, which is slightly more reasonable. S. Sega Rally Championship. Admittedly, due to my gaming preferences and the quality of titles beginning with S, I might not even choose Sega Rally Championship in my top 5 S games. But please, I dare you to think of the Sega Saturn and not think of Sega Rally. If you were there, you were there. And you know how much of a massive deal Sega Rally Championship was. This was the arcade at home finally, and what a conversion. Legendary controls and physics. Sure, it was about 5 minutes worth of content, but you had to be there, man. And you cannot have a Sega Saturn without Sega Rally in it, and it still plays great to this day. Also, what is it with S? There was the same issue on the Dreamcast where you could make a top 10 just from S games alone. I think I might have to make a part 2 for the Sega Saturn as well. T. 3 Dirty Dwarves. Now this was a choice that was tougher than I expected, not because of the sheer amount of competition between quality titles, but the lack of it. T is no S, but of the bunch, 3 Dirty Dwarves sticks out to me the most. It's a Sega Saturn console exclusive and is an unusual beat 'em up. You can have 3 people playing together, each controlling one dwarf who has their own special ability, seemingly random baseballing and bowling or a shotgun. Playing by yourself is really difficult since one hit is enough to knock your current dwarf Sparko. They can be revived by hitting them, but it is not an easy thing to do in the chaos and the lane changing mechanics. I definitely need to spend more time with this one to get used to it, but it does have some promise. U. Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3. You can't go wrong with a bit of Mortal Kombat, and as far as I'm aware, this is one of the best renditions of the second edition of MK3. In comparison to MK Trilogy, which is also on the Saturn and is even more updated than this, it is definitely a secondary option, but it fits the U letter well. Not many options, and it would be a hardcore brutal fighting game to add to your Sega Saturn collection. I love old school MK, but damn, I was so crap at it. It's probably what made me so bitter against fighters for the rest of my life. I like Mortal Kombat, but I'd probably like other fighters a lot more if I'd never played it and if it never kicked my ass. Virtua Fighter 2 is an iconic fighter and one that Sega Saturn fans were really wanting on their system. This was a good port of the original game, but this is where it's at for 3D fighter fans. Some say the Virtua Fighter series is for the gentleman fighter, the pro fighters who actually wear clothes and brush their hair. I'm rambling because I don't know much about this entry myself. It's one of the best-selling Sega Saturn games and one of the best-selling arcade games of all time, and it is a bunch of pick-up-and-play fun. By the time you get to Pi, though, she's gonna kick your ass. Oh my god, Pi! WipeOut 2097 is the second game in the WipeOut series. The Saturn also got the first game, but this is an improvement. Maybe not technically, but gameplay-wise, it's a fun, futuristic racer. Compared to the PS1 versions, it's poor running at a worse frame rate and having slightly lower quality visuals. But if you didn't know any better, it's one of the best racing games on the system. Although I did literally just watch a DF Retro episode that showed off that Sega in the West were so upset of the poor PS1 ports, they preferred not to have them at all since it made the console look bad. And so this was the last WipeOut game for the Sega Saturn, but like I said, if you like futuristic races, I'm playing it and I'm enjoying it. X-Men vs Street Fighter may not be the first choice of fighter that fans of this franchise mashup will be drawn to. It's the first game in the Marvel vs Capcom series, which means while it's fun to pick up and play on the Saturn, fans are more likely to gravitate to Marvel vs Capcom 2 on the Dreamcast. But if you've got a Saturn, this is one of the visual stars. 2D, yes, but it's aged like Monica Bellucci, i.e. it seems to look better in 2024 than it did on release. Wait, that sounds like I'm comparing it to Bellucci at birth. I'm losing this analogy. They're both hotter than ever is what I'm trying to say. Technically, I have no idea what's going on, but just look at the sprites. And despite not normally enjoying fighting games, I was having so much fun. I really enjoyed playing this, and maybe the Saturn is beginning to turn my head when it comes to fighting games. Have I turned a corner? Maybe. Why? Yumimi Mix Remix is a Japanese-only Saturn game, but it has a fan translation. And look, this is not an essential game by any means, but it is one of the most unique Saturn games that is now available in English. It's not quite a visual novel, it's an animation adventure game where you make choices as you are part of the life of Yumimi as she wakes up late for school and sees some weird things like ghosts going on with her characterful collection of classmates. Strange, interesting, and charming. Z, or Z. Zero Divide: The Final Conflict is a game made by people who really love Virtua Fighter, or really love to copy Virtua Fighter, because to the untrained eye, i.e. myself, they play and look phenomenally similar, but this one has a robot sci-fi theme to it. And it plays well enough when the CPU isn't destroying your arse. It's got some cool, if perhaps unmemorable characters aside from the Scorpion dude. The gimmick for this one is a bit like fighting Vipers, where you knock off various parts of the armor and then you can deal more damage if you hit the exposed parts. If you like fighters, it's definitely worth importing. It's the third and final game in the series, the first of which saw a worldwide release on the PlayStation 1, and the second game saw a European PS1 release, but this third game is a Japanese exclusive to the Sega Saturn. The music is pretty awesome too. And there we have the Saturn's essentials of A to Z. Some tough choices in there which probably warrants a second one sometime in the future. Which console would you like me to tackle next? Let me know in the comments below, and if you want to join in, I've left a blank A to Z template and a link to the list of all Sega Saturn games. Subscribe, and if you want to watch videos early like this one and ad-free, check out my Patreon, also linked below. I hope you all have a fantastic day. Take care.